till this ad runs.
AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.
Good afternoon, Mr. Vasilash.
John, how are you?
I'm doing well. You got something to stump us with?
So you had a piece on LinkedIn this week about motorcycles.
Yeah, I did.
So I have a question for you about motorcycles, and this is like a fungo. I'm just throwing this ball, and you're just gonna whack it. This is just so easy.
Let's hear it.
Okay, so on August 29th, 1885, two guys patented the motorcycle. What were their names, their full names, and what do they call it?
Well, it wasn't Harley and Davidson. I'm pretty sure of that. Who would have patented? Okay, you got to give us some hints here. In the U.S. or in Europe? Probably happened in Europe first.
That's what I'm thinking. Keep going.
Okay, first. And what did they call it?
We didn't get to who they are yet.
Oh, we didn't get to who they are. I don't think I'm going to get to who they are.
Oh, I'm sure you did.
Okay, well, now we got to let everybody know. We got Jeff Schuster from Global Data here, David Welch from Bloomberg here. So are you guys stumped too? You have any ideas? You can say anything you want because
I'm thinking German, but
yeah,
that's as
German
far as
sounds
I
good.
might go with Italian.
But you're going Italian?
I would think French,
French?
actually.
Okay. Wow.
So
We're all
We got
over
the
the
European
place.
Union here practically. Nobody said Britain, so I guess we do have the European Union here. First of all, I'm surprised you didn't think it was Harley and Davidson.
That was actually my first thought.
See, that was what.
I don't know what the first names are.
But it was
I always thought
actually
Harley
it was
Davidson.
actually Gottlieb Daimler and Wilhelm Maybach,
really,
and they called it the Reitwagen.
I don't know that history at all. That's
No,
amazing.
got
Boy,
me
I
as
never
well.
heard that.
So Harley Davidson was founded actually in 1903.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't become incorporated as the Harley Davidson Motorcycle Company or Harley Davidson Motor Company until September 17th, 1907. So if we ever have a show on September 17th, keep that in mind.
Keep that in mind. But
Yeah.
wow, Daimler and
Harley
Maybach.
has been in the news in the past couple of weeks.
Right. They dropped
For-
their DEI
Well,
stuff.
back in their
Right.
DEI program, and then Ford has also
Right.
reined it in a bit.
That's right. Well, let's get to other stuff. We got Jeff Schuster here, and I'm dying to ask him, Jeff, what is going on in the American market right now? Because I asked this. At the beginning of this year, everybody was like, oh, thank God we got the chip shortage
Right,
behind
we're
us. The
past
COVID
that.
stuff is behind us. This is going to be a good year. We're going to go over 16 million SAAR. And what I'm reading now is the August SAAR is going to come in at 15.2 million. That's way below what everyone thought it would be.
And this is perfect timing because you guys came out with your numbers today.
That surprises
We
me
did.
too, because weren't there there should have been not a lot, but some sales from the CDK hack in July
Yeah.
that got punted into August. So I would have thought August would be artificially a little bit higher.
Yeah, and that's the issue is, so obviously June lower because of the hack. July you expected a rebound. We saw some, didn't really see what we were expecting. August is a repeat of that, really. So now we've got 3 months of a down market that didn't get the lift that we expected back up from the CDK hack. And now 3 months in my book does make a trend. And I think we are looking at a slowing, or at least a leveling off of demand, kind of in could be sub 16. We're teetering on 15.9, 16 at the moment for the US sales
For the year?
for the year. Still, not a bad year.
No,
Certainly,
but it's not what
but
everybody
it's
thought
not
it would
what
be.
the
Hey,
expectation
what did you guys think
was.
at the beginning of the year? What was your prediction?
So we were actually at 61 at the beginning of the year, and then the spring, May was strong. The spring led us to: are we looking at a stronger market? Do we need to bump this up? So we were kind of between 16.1 and 16.2, and then the last 3 months is pulling us back. So I think the pattern is, we're looking for a second half of the year. You get some interest rate cuts that now we're likely to see in September. Maybe you get prices moderating and falling. They haven't to the extent that we had hoped, but they are. It's not enough.
So could it be consumers are reading the news or watching the news and thinking, here's Jerome Powell, he's going to cut interest rates. If I hold off, I might get,
Yeah.
I mean, do consumers think that way when it comes to buying cars?
I
Or
think
enough
there's
of them?
they've gotten quite savvy, and I think they're paying attention. Certainly COVID led everybody to figure out ways around problems, and I think obviously the vehicle industry was a problem. Just trying to find a vehicle, let alone one that you wanted, was an issue.
How much of this is just monthly payment shock? People go to the dealership and they want to buy a car, and between the prices that are still high, okay, everyone talks about rebates and all this, but they're still historically high, and interest rates are really high. You're looking at monthly payments that are still, the average payment is still $735 a month.
Yeah, you've got a $45,000 average that's been there for a while on a vehicle transaction price. Incentives are rising to help offset that, but again, they're still well below historic levels.
Yeah, I think it's monthly
So
payment.
I think
really
I think
high right now.
consumers, we've turned this into a luxury vehicle market essentially, and I think you've displaced a lot of consumers that haven't come back in yet. Now the question will be, and this is why maybe a lower market is our future. Will those buyers be able to come back in? Will prices get down? Will interest rates fall enough to get that monthly payment down so that your average consumer can afford a new vehicle again?
Will the OEMs be interested perhaps in making vehicles that are somewhat more affordable for these consumers, or will they just simply say, you know what, why bother?
GM's having pretty good success with the Trax that sells for under 25, starts around 21.
Yeah, it's doing very well.
Yeah,
but if you look at their portfolio,
they're
all
skewed away from,
they're all expensive vehicles. And
it is,
like,
but
we've got this one that's inexpensive.
But so look at Ford. Okay, the Maverick I think starts under 30, but but most of them sell for
they're
optioned up exactly.
And then the Escape starts at 35. So Ford, brand for every man, every woman, every family, they're not selling much that gets down in the low 20s like a Trax does. Who else really plays there, Jeff? You look at what Kia, Hyundai
are dominating. Maybe
Honda,
Toyota
still have vehicles
they do.
Nissan, right?
Yeah, Nissan. Yeah,
but there aren't a lot. It's not a lot of.
Your choices
No,
are
because you can't make money there, and these guys are getting excoriated by Wall Street unless they improve their margins, so they move their product
it's all
up.
a margin play, right. But at some point it tips, and I think they have to refocus and figure out how to make money in these lower segments again.
We're back to what Roger Smith said. The entry level vehicle is a used Buick, but that's where we are, right?
Yeah, we are
used
right
vehicles.
now.
Look, the average payment being $735 a month. Now that's for a $48,000 vehicle, but even if most of these cheaper vehicles are in the high 30s, you're still looking at payments in the 600s, 500s. Average household incomes, what, 69,000? So I did a story on this about it. When they hit the peak of like $780 a month, nerdwallet.com has loan information and so forth, but they also have what families should be spending on their mortgage, on their car payment, and all that. And what the average, unless they're spending disproportionately on cars, what they should be spending is like $300 a month, and there's just not a lot for sale there. So it is. Right. It's a luxury market even when you're not buying luxury, and that's where we are. Could somebody go in and make a lot of profit but not margin by selling people those vehicles and marketing it? Yeah, they probably could.
Probably get volume, right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, leasing has come back a little bit, but again, not where it needs to be for those that are trying to get that monthly payment down and get into something. Even those have gone through the roof.
Mm-hmm.
So it's incumbent on the auto industry to come out with cars that are more affordable, right?
Yeah, if there's a reason for them to do it, though,
right?
And therein lies, therein lies a question, and this gets to the point when we were talking before the show, about like Chinese cars. So what is the American consumer to do when she or he hears about vehicles that are highly economical, and then they go to their local Ford dealer and say, there's nothing here that I can afford, and I understand that there are these vehicles that are being sold in other parts of the world, of the Western world they're costing a fraction of that. Well, they get upset.
They will, and maybe unnecessarily so, because yes, Chinese vehicles are cheaper, but if you homologate that same car, it's not selling for $8,000, $12,000 in the U.S.
But you can homologate it for $2,000 or $3,000. So if it's let's say a 14,
no, but it's not just homologating it for U.S. emissions. There are other safety requirements.
no,
and
I'm
things
talking
that
the whole ball of wax. I think
I'm not sure it's only 3,000. I've been told it's more. Look, point is they will be cheaper than most of the cars on the market in the U.S., but you're not going to get it for 6,000 or 8,000.
No.
So when people read
correct.
this, they're like, "Oh my God, I'm getting gouged," and it's just like, the reporting that people will react to won't be as radical as the stories we've seen on this, where look, these and they're also much smaller vehicles that Americans clearly don't want, right? But Chinese vehicles, if they came here, would find willing buyers in the same way that Korean vehicles did when they first got here, and Japanese vehicles did when they first got here. They
There's
were
a
cheap,
template,
usable
yeah.
transportation.
Yep.
For sure they would. But the political reality is there's not going to be any Chinese cars in this country. I believe not even if they're made in Mexico, Thailand, or Vietnam, or any other country. I think.
Oh, they're moving to wall that off, right?
And this is a bipartisan effort to wall them
right,
off.
regardless of who ends up in the White House.
That's right.
It doesn't even have to be tariffs. The Commerce Department is all over connected vehicles. Every car these days is connected. So the only way the Chinese could legally right now bring a vehicle in is build it in Mexico, and all of the software, connected software, and some of the hardware. I mean, look, these rules aren't finalized. We wrote about it, but you'll see what'll be pretty close to the final proposal in the next month or so. And then there'll be another comment period, probably going into effect next year and finalized in January. What the proposal looks like right now is any connected software from China is a no-go. Some of the hardware, and what they're saying is like cellular radios, transmitters, anything where a signal could be intercepted. They don't want Chinese knowing where all the vehicles are and where individual people's vehicles are. So, and this is the excuse they're using anyways. So if that goes through and it's law, or it's the rules, you have to build it in Mexico. You have to do it, find sources for American, Canadian, European connected software and some hardware. A lot of hoops they have to go through to get vehicles into this market.
But what if this were a $20,000 or $18,000 ICE vehicle that was not connected with anything beyond a FM radio?
I mean, look, theoretically, you'd be able to bring it in.
You could do it.
So if
Theoretically, right now,
That's what I mean.
believe we put up the 100% tariffs. Okay. Now we're looking at putting in any connected car, Chinese stuff. We're going to block that too. If they find some way around that, we're going to figure out another way to block them. I'm telling you, there's no way Chinese cars are going to come into the U.S. market.
Both parties have a strong will to do this. Look, I remember in college, I took a class, the economic development of Japan. We talked about the trade wars between the U.S. and Japan. They kept U.S. towels out of Japan by saying that the cotton fibers were too thick for the Japanese ear canal or something like that. Like it can get into ridiculous.
They kept American skis out because they said Japanese snow was different.
Yeah,
they prevented American aluminum bats from going in because they said that they weren't safe. The only thing that they allowed with no problem whatsoever was American cigarettes. True story.
Wow.
But they kept everything else out.
Remember the trouble Saturn had in Japan? Remember that whole saga?
Which one?
Saturn.
Oh, yeah.
It was a nightmare. So, yeah, and the Japanese did it, and it wasn't even, you didn't even have, dangerous foreign adversary kind of stuff going on. It was just protectionism.
So Jeff, you guys found that sales globally are not as robust as perhaps you thought they would be.
Yeah, it's just not the U.S. So we are seeing Western Europe cool. Western Europe has the same issues that we do. Definitely pricing issues is the big one. Affordability, and prices are just not coming down, and consumers are responding by not buying vehicles. So similar to what we're seeing in the U.S., but we're seeing that happen definitely across Western Europe. You've got Russia coming back from nothing last year because of the war in Ukraine. So there's some lift there. You have Japan and Korea didn't suffer as much from the chip shortage, so they're having hard year-over-year comparisons. So they're not doing great. China, is the price war cooling? You've got some that have backed out, so there's some issues there as well. Although last couple months have been okay, kind of where we expected it. So yeah, there's kind of a mixed picture really around the world. We've taken out 2.5 million units since the beginning of the year out of the global picture. So
Where does that come out of? Does any of it come out of China?
a little bit has, not much. Most of it's come out of Western Europe and a little bit out of the US as well.
So where do you guys see the global SAAR being at the end of the
Yeah,
year?
so the end of the year right now we're under 89 million. So we were expecting to push that 90 million, everything's fine zone, and it doesn't look like we're going to get there this year. So we're at 88.7 to be precise, I guess.
And we also saw the ACEA, the European organization today say July EV sales took a nosedive, mainly because of Germany. Some other markets were up. I think the Netherlands, Belgium, France were okay, but man, EV sales fell off a cliff in Germany.
Well, and that's the sub story to all of this as well, is again because of pricing issues and concerns with a slower EV transition with consumers. You have that affecting markets, not just Western Europe, but we saw a little bit of it in China as well. But as those consumers don't buy them, they don't have the ICE choices that we have to the same level, I should say, that we have in the US to counter it. So it's definitely pulling the whole market down to some extent, Western Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So what happened to EVs in Germany then? Why the big fall off?
37% down.
Yeah, it was a big number.
Partly government rebates or sales
Fell off,
incentives.
right.
The money dried up.
Right.
So, but that happened at the beginning of the year.
It did. It
They had
happened.
it was in December of last year that they just put the kibosh on it. I mean, they just
Is there
did it
some
like,
sort of grandfathering in though, or something like
no,
that?
they just cut it off.
No,
And
so some of it again, it's base effects. You've got last year things were going pretty strongly, so it's tough when you do those year over year.
So what I thought was interesting about the ACEA numbers, which you're referring to, is so from January to July, this is passenger car registrations, EVs had 12.5% of the whole market. Diesels had 12.8% of the market.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
That's
Yeah,
just in
because there
Europe.
was a point where Europe was bumping up around 20% market share, right?
yeah.
18-20%. So that's a big drop.
Yeah. We've pulled down BEVs in Europe from a share standpoint this year. We had at the beginning of the year, I think we're right around 16, a little under 16%, and we've cut about 2% out of that, and it could end up being weaker actually.
And PHEVs are not doing well either.
They are not in Europe. Part of it availability, but it's just it's not a technology that necessarily has worked like it is here or like it is in China.
Meanwhile, hybrids, just regular old hybrids, strong hybrids, but off to the races. I mean, they were up like 25% or something like that. So, wow.
I know people who are still kind of leery of plug-in hybrids because it has a plug, and I had somebody tell me this recently that they didn't want to. I'm like, but when you run out of juice, you're still driving around on the gas
You
cylinder.
have a
It's
gas
okay.
engine, right?
So there's just the industry has done, honestly, I think a really inadequate job of explaining to people how they can charge their vehicles, whether it's pure battery electrics or plug-ins. It can be done. I mean, you can take road trips and that sort of thing. People are just like,
I think there's a general confusion on all the terminologies that we're using on a everyday basis.
and now they want to add EREV to this whole
Right,
thing, which
yeah.
I'm sorry, that term shouldn't exist. And EREV is, and
I'm
EREV is
bullish on EREVs. I'm really bullish on EREVs.
I am too. What I'm saying is that the term, it's a plug-in hybrid. Consumers don't care when the engine's running, when it's not running. They don't care. They just want to, they just tell them they're getting more mileage and tell them they're getting longer range. That's all they care about. I mean,
You can go this
I
far.
remember when the Chevy Volt and it was discovered, the first generation, occasionally if you were really laying on the accelerator, I think actually the gasoline engine gave it a little bit of boost. It wasn't just charging the motor. It was so scandalous. Look, we wrote about it like everybody else did, but I remember thinking, like, the guy driving the car does not care.
Right.
Like he's getting, what was it, 52 or 60 miles per gallon, whatever it was rated at, and he could drive X amount of range. He never had to worry about, running out of battery. And that's all consumers care about. And there are mild hybrids and there are strong plug-in hybrids. And like now we got EREV. No one's going to understand what this is. A classic example of the industry, like sort of too many people in the industry talking to each other and not really understanding like how to just simply explain.
I don't know if you can simply explain it, because I've tried to explain plug-in hybrids to people and they go, you mean you got to plug it in? I go, yeah, but it's got a gasoline engine. You mean I can fill it up with gas? Yeah, but you can plug it in too. Well, you just said it had a gasoline engine. I mean, the public just, they don't get it.
But isn't part of it that, okay, the industry at large really had no reason to educate people about plug-in hybrids, because there really weren't that many plug-in hybrids. When Chrysler came out with the Pacifica plug-in hybrid, they said, no, we'll just call it a hybrid because we'll confuse people otherwise, right? So they didn't say, we'll call this a plug-in hybrid and we will explain to people
what that means.
Yeah.
What I'd love to know is how many plug-in hybrid owners actually have a home charger, because you don't need it. And I'm in the process of...
What you're saying is you can just use a 110 outlet.
Just using 110.
Sure. And, once you run out of juice with the plug-in hybrid, your mileage isn't that great often. So, and with a 110, it takes forever to charge it, even though it's a smaller battery. So I wonder how many people actually go out and get it, and if they're frequently just driving around with no battery.
Well, this is the complaint of many environmentalists and to a degree, even the EPA, that they don't want to give automakers full ZEV credits for these vehicles because they're afraid they're not going to get plugged in. They're going to be running on gasoline. But I got to believe if you've got this thing, you went to the dealer explained it to you, and you bought this thing, you might be tempted to plug it in and see what's going to happen.
See what it's about. Yeah.
Because, if you got the right drive range cycle, duty cycle,
plug-in hybrids.
You never go to a gas station. You pretty much drive on electricity all the time unless you want to do a long trip.
But, John, you were mentioning about, hybrid sales being up. So those European numbers were, hybrid sales were up 25.7%, while EVs were down 10.8% and plugins were down 14.1%.
This is Europe you're talking about?
Yeah. So you look at that delta. I mean, it's
massive.
It's a huge thing. Yeah. So the question becomes, why the love for hybrids versus apparently no love for plug-in hybrids?
Well, because it's easy to understand. You don't have to plug it in. There's no range anxiety. There's no charging time anxiety.
Too. Cheaper. There's more of them. Yeah.
Right. And they get terrific fuel economy. And in markets, especially like Europe, where gasoline is typically $7 a gallon or thereabouts, if you're getting 45, 50 miles to the gallon, yowza.
Big difference.
Now, having said that, they've had diesels that got that kind of fuel economy. And in many markets in Europe, diesel's cheaper than gasoline. So they've had to fight that. But for whatever reason, the European public and even the American public has gone, wowza, this hybrid stuff's pretty good.
So, Jeff, why do you think that the domestic manufacturers have not been strong hybrid producers over the last few years?
It's a cost issue to a degree. It's where do you put your eggs? Your investment, your basket that only goes so far, and what's the future look like? And I think it's making instead of taking a basket approach to the technology, it's going all in on one version of it. And that was most of the world. Europe and North America did that. It's really the Japanese that held back. And part of that is their just conservative approach to these big trend decisions. And it right now is benefiting them. And now you've got the pivot where everyone is re-looking at hybrid technology and trying to better what they have and get launches out.
Yeah, and I think, look, with the U.S. car companies, there's a lot pushing them toward pure electrics. One is the regulatory landscape is. Two is Wall Street, right? Tesla had this great valuation. Startups, even those without a product, were getting funded And then some of the, let's call them better startups who are still struggling, Lucid and Rivian, had great valuations as well. So, Wall Street's rewarding companies for going all electric. And look, Tesla's vehicle sales growth was great, and they're a profitable company. I think what could be like the biggest head fake in the industry's history, if this EV thing really does kind of stall out for a long time, is Tesla had all this great growth, and everyone thought, okay, the world's turned. People want EVs. Turns out that a certain kind of luxury buyer wants EVs, and the rest of American consumers are kind of scratching their heads over it. Look, there's still EV growth. I think like we as media need to like really get a good handle on what's going on in the market, which is it's growing. We've hit the flat part of the S curve.
Yeah, it's just not where expectations
Well,
were.
the big problem is the automakers overinvested to the points that you were making. They thought the market had swung. They looked at Tesla. Wall Street was pushing them, and they went that way. They went too far.
And yeah, there have been delays, there have been cancellations, but there's still a lot of models coming that are going to fight for a smaller piece than they would have or what they expected.
But I've always said, or I've been saying for years on this show, I expect around 2027-ish time frame is when the EV segment will really start to grow. We'll have second generation platforms, second generation batteries. There's going to be plenty of public charging by that time. That's when I think it's going to go.
That's key. Infrastructure is right now a massive roadblock for a lot of consumers that they don't want to wait. I mean, we're all impatient with everything, right? As a consumer, you don't want to wait for things, and they're used to filling their tank up and that's it. So if you can get over that issue and at least bring the charge time down, bring the convenience factor up, where you don't have to plot your trip around charging stations that take you out of your way, that'll go a long way for, I think, getting share and getting more consumers on board.
So here's another one. We reported this week, Auto Forecast Solutions says there's going to be an electric Stingray Corvette built in Lansing Grand River, not in Bowling Green, and it's going to be presumably on the Ultium platform. Is that going to fly with Corvette buyers? David?
It could. It could also bring in a new kind of Corvette buyer. With the traditional Corvette buyer, I think they'll have some kind of an aversion to it because they like the sound of an engine. Which look, you can make that up.
Still may have, right?
But do they think it's the real thing? I mean, and look, that's an older crowd, and they kind of like the old gasoline noise and feel, and so they may still want that. It could bring in a new kind of buyer, though. For the old crowd, that vehicle is going to handle a lot differently. And are they going to like that? I think that could do pretty well, actually.
Yeah, what do you think?
There's a market for it. Yeah, I think so. Obviously, depends ultimately on how well it does, on its styling. It should
performance should be
well. Performance
leading eye performance
should be there. Price, but yeah, there'll be a market for
Another
it.
thing, supposedly, according to Auto Forecast again, is that there's going to be a D segment SUV Corvette branded, also coming out of the same plant.
So I had a story on this like 3 years ago.
Yeah, that's been in and out of the rumor mill.
Mm-hmm.
Within the Corvette design studio, Chevy, I think it's the Chevy design studio where they do it. They had a few different concepts. They had an electric Corvette. These were all electric vehicles, by the way. They had one that was sort of like imagine like a Lamborghini Urus sort of configuration.
Right.
And they did have like some kind of like, call it a sedan, but it's, really like a Porsche Taycan sort of execution. Like they had a few different concepts like this, but they were looking at sort of a Corvette family and sub-brand to kind of, look how much Ferrari's worth, right? So they've talked about coming up with a Corvette sub-brand that's a few different configuration of vehicles. So like D segment SUV, that I hadn't, at the time I reported this, it was several years ago. Actually, I remember when it was right around the whole January 6th thing, because I had the story done that day, and then that just sucked up the zone for media coverage. But there was like a sedan and like an SUV-ish sort of thing going on. I think they're going to expand that line.
Yeah. What do you think?
Well, I mean,
Don't you think, Gary, they
So,
should
so the
expand it?
first half, there were 18,000 Corvettes sold in the United States. Okay, not a big number, right? So anything they can add to that is going to be gravy for them. So let's say they come out with a full electric. I think every one of those that they build will be purchased. That people will just want them because the people who buy Corvettes want to buy Corvettes. I think they buy it because it is a Corvette, not because it's an electric vehicle, not because it's a, like the E-Ray, which gets like zero attention, hybrid, wonderful to drive, as you know. So if Porsche could extend its showroom to what it has, why shouldn't Corvette do that? And
Bentley has,
Yeah, a lot of-
Lamborghini
a lot of
has.
them. A lot of them
they'll sell
have.
every one. I mean, it's
Yeah,
just
I mean, I guess in that sense, you think of it as a brand and not a badge.
right.
I mean, look, I saw I know the Bentley Bentega's been out for a long time. I finally saw one on the road around here for the first time ever. And it was coming up behind me, and I saw it in the rearview mirror. And honestly, it looked like an English delivery van. Like if you made a delivery van out of like a London cab, that's what it looked like. I'm like, is that the Bentley? Yes,
What is that thing? Yeah.
And it's, look, it's about like you take that Bentley design language and put it on an SUV. It's about as awkward as you can get. But Porsche made it work with its SUVs, and Ferrari's extended the line. I mean, it's a big line of sports cars, but look, the Lamborghini Urus, pretty good execution of taking a sports car into like a crossover kind of thing, and it's a little cheaper relative to the Lambo line, and I think they've had pretty good success with that in terms of selling it.
Yeah. No, look, we've talked on the show for years about why aren't they expanding the Corvette line? They're sitting on a gold mine. To your point, David, look at Ferrari's valuation. I mean, I'm not saying that Corvette could hit that, but that's the guide lamp right there of where to go.
They can make some money there.
Iconic brand, absolutely. Yeah.
I don't think it's quite Ferrari exclusivity, though. I mean, therein
No.
lies the.
And look, another part of Ferrari's money-making ability too is, someone told me this recently, that its Formula One team is the only one that makes money with the sponsorships and all that. The others break even or lose money.
That's entirely possible. That's entirely possible. It's hard to break out what the Formula One budget is from Ferrari's finances. But there was
I was told the racing program itself makes money, and that most of the others do not, particularly in Formula One, and it's more about marketing for the auto companies that run it.
That's true of all racing, not just Formula One. Hey, look, we got to take a quick break right now. Give a shout out to our great sponsor, Bridgestone. We'll be back in just a sec.
Keeping your heart racing in and out of the gym. That's what really matters. Bridgestone Potenza Sport AS tires with a 50,000-mile limited warranty.
All right, we're back. Gary, I know you always have a good list of things to get into. What's on your list there?
All right, so one of the things we've been talking about on the show for the past few episodes is this whole notion of whether traditional OEMs can have the quickness and responsiveness that they need to be competitive in today's environment. And so I saw this quote that came out from General Motors while hearing it all about this. Quote, BrightDrop was born in GM's innovation lab and spent the last 3 years as a wholly owned subsidiary. That structure allowed BrightDrop to operate with the agility and innovation of a tech startup and benefit from GM's deep manufacturing expertise. So what does General Motors announce it's going to do with BrightDrop?
Fold it into Chevrolet.
Fold it into Chevrolet.
Look, I didn't write this. I didn't even say it on TV anywhere. I told someone in General Motors public relations, someone who's been out of the company for 3 years now, so it's got to be 4 years ago. I said, they're just going to fold it into Chevy at some point, because the Chevy brand and the dealers are going to say, wait a minute, you're selling commercial vehicles. That's our job. And by the way, the Chevy dealers have relationships with fleet buyers. Right. They have facilities to repair the stuff. Like, why would you, in essence, create this commercial Saturn to go and sell electric vans? I mean, I get in some ways why they wanted to brand it separately and all of that, but the numbers they're selling
It's
isn't
not
that
large enough.
big.
It's not large enough.
And the commercial van business isn't that big in the
no,
U.S.
to stand on its own.
Isn't it what, a couple 100,000 units a year
Yeah.
total? So and
Incubate it and then release it back to the brand.
but so if it's a couple 100,000 units a year total commercial van, that's not just electric. That's all of them, right? And the electric portion's maybe 10%, probably less.
I would think less. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you
So
count the-
it's not a lot of volume between Ford, Rivian, GM. Who else is making electric?
Mercedes is in the
Mercedes.
business.
One.
Ram is, well, they don't have vans per se, but they're in the commercial
Yeah,
business.
yep, they are.
I'm just talking about who's selling electric vans right now. Ford and GM are, and then like Rivian does
Rivian,
those vans
right.
for. I just passed one on the way here for Amazon. So and it's just not that big a business. I mean, it will grow, I think, but it's just not that big.
Right.
So in October 2021, General Motors said that BrightDrop's revenue would top $10 billion by 2030 with low 20% profit margins.
Let's go back to the drawing board on that one, because that's not going to happen, as we've just discussed here. No, look, I think it was probably smart to have BrightDrop separate to develop the van.
I think so.
Because you can go much faster than the legacy operation would be able to. But I think, to your point, David, all the commercial connections at the retail end of the is in Chevrolet.
Once you've launched, it just makes more sense to do it that way.
Okay, but what happens to this culture of innovation and agility? I mean, I speaking of Saturn, they brought that back in, and that didn't last long, did it?
I mean,
Numi, where are the lessons from Numi? Nowhere.
I mean, BrightDrop did develop some software to help fleet managers manage the fleet and so forth, and maybe that helped them. But I mean, what did they develop that was like startup speed and all this sort of thing? And and as far as what the 20 or 30 billion, geez, there's not a lot in that GM investor presentation from 3 or 4 years ago that I said this in my book, that they weren't going to hit that double the revenue thing. I mean, Cruise is not going to get to 50 billion in revenue anytime that we can foresee, because and I don't think anyone else will either. It's not just Cruise. Robotaxi is just not. It's just taking
happening.
It's
Geofence, outside of geofenced areas.
I mean, look, there's some good stuff going on with Robotaxi, but 50 billion, and then by the end of the decade, I don't see happening. Doubling, their sales, a large chunk with electric vehicles because they have a bigger waterfront of vehicles. They do actually, by the end of 2025 in the US, GM is going to have, from Bolt on up to Hummers and Escalades, a pretty good waterfront of vehicles covered, but the market's not getting there that quickly yet. And then the software services and BrightDrop revenue, like all of this stuff, I just, it's so little right now, and there's not a lot of momentum. I don't see how they get there. They could find growth in all of these businesses. It's just not going to be these big numbers that we're throwing out there.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jeff, I want to hear your thoughts here about robo-taxis. I mean, you seem somewhat, shall we say, skeptical?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's good reason to be. They've been promised for a while by different parties who can be named or remain nameless. But yeah, obviously they've made some headway. And I think it depends where you are and where you go. Obviously, San Francisco is a different environment than Detroit in that, certainly. But I think they have a place. They will serve a purpose, but just kind of turning them loose in widespread robo-taxis in the next several years, I think not going to happen. I think just reality. It's a lot harder to get to that stage than to the stage we're at right now. And we continue to see advancements. Obviously, AI is going to help with that development, speeding up the development, but it's just not there yet. And I think then you've got to convince consumers once the technology is there or close. And I just don't think we're going to see it anytime soon.
Well, you were mentioning before about how the traditionals invested mainly in EVs and
right,
forwent hybrids. General Motors certainly is spending some good coin on autonomous technology.
Yeah.
Is it going to get to the point where they're going to say we're spreading this too thin?
Well, I think that's a risk, and I think this is the other great pivot that we saw in recent months or years, and that is, the industry went from, okay, instead of going from where we are today with autonomous driving technology, we're going to skip all the levels and we're going to go right to 5. Let's not worry about anything else. We'll develop 5, and obviously that became more of a test than I think most thought. Certainly those on the West Coast thought, and now it's let's go back because we can make money in level 2 and 3 by adding some of this content and getting consumers to pay for it. And now you're kind of marrying that issue with the EV issue, with the pricing issue in the regular market, and all of those are kind of spinning around the consumer. And I think that's another piece of why we're seeing delays in a lot of this. It all does come down to an affordability issue.
Well, also, look, there's still a safety issue, and it's not that they aren't safe, but Cruise had their problems. Waymo's had problems too, right? They hit a cyclist recently. They weren't seriously injured, but when these things happen, everybody takes stops. I think few people will argue that against Waymo having the best robotaxi technology out there, right?
In the United States.
Yeah.
Meanwire, in
In
China,
China,
there's a
there's-
lot more
right,
going on. I
A lot
think,
more
what do we
activity.
say?
Yeah, but like the New York Times did a story that that the Chinese government suppresses negative stories about robotaxi, or negative news about robotaxis because they want to develop the technology. So you don't get, when a cyclist gets hit or a fire truck gets hit, you don't have this huge furor over it in China like you do here. Waymo is moving pretty cautiously, given that they've been working on this technology for 14 or 15 years. That tells me something. I'm not saying it's not ready. Clearly, I mean, they're operating it, but it's not in big numbers. They are adding some production that came out this week, but it's still small amounts of production. And they're moving cautiously, which is probably smart. But it just tells you it's not going to be a huge business. Yeah. There is interesting stuff kind of like
not a huge business this decade
yet, right?
Look, I don't know when it's going to be, but it's still years away before it's a huge business. But there's money going into it. I mean, GM is still funding Cruise. Sure. Look at May Mobility is getting funded by Toyota, and they're doing some interesting stuff. Now theirs is extremely geo-fenced. It's actually set routes. Yeah. So they're going a much more simple solution than the others are, which I think is pretty smart too. Like Edwin Olson years ago, he runs May Mobility. He and I were talking about this, and his theory on technology is basically that, like, Amazon didn't start off selling us everything. They started off selling us books and music, and then they were in supply chain, they were in consumer, electronic payment and all these things, and then they just kept growing it, and now they sell us everything. And he looked at autonomy that way, like you got to figure out some basic driving and keep going.
So, speaking of autonomous vehicles, this is one part of Hyundai had a big investor day yesterday, and this is Hyundai Global, and they announced that they're targeting 5.55 million annual global sales by 2030, which is up 30% from 2023. They aim to sell 2 million EVs per year globally by 2030, which is roughly 36% of all of their sales will be EVs. They're going to introduce, and you'll like this, new EREV models. So they'll have those, and they're going to launch them in North.
Plug-in hybrids.
That's right. Excuse me. They're going to have 21 EV models by 2030, ranging from affordable to luxury and high performance. And they'll expand their EV offerings to 14 models from a current 7. And I did the math on their hybrid sales, and they're looking to basically about a third of their sales will be hybrids by 2030. They're going to this is the weirdest thing in the world. The Hyundai Motor Group Meta Plant America, which is in Georgia, and it was going to be an all EV plant, and they're going to build they're building the Ioniq 5 there. They're going to build the Ioniq 9 there. And they're going to build hybrids there now. So they've decided they're going to do that. So it's your
Interesting. Are they going to be EREV hybrids?
pivot.
You mean plug-in hybrids?
Yeah, that one too.
They will begin mass production of the new EREV in North America and China by the end of 2026.
Okay, so
They
it will
will.
be EREVs.
They will.
So whether they're going to make it at the Meta plant, though, that's not clear.
I bet they will because they
Yeah,
only
I
have
think
one
they
other
will.
plant here, and
Yeah,
that's all
that makes
pure
sense.
ice. Right.
You don't know. They could be very clever, and they could just build a plant like that. But this is interesting. You guys talk about autonomous vehicles, and I'd never heard this term before. You guys can educate me on this. It says Hyundai Motor plans to launch a foundry business that will sell autonomous vehicles to various global autonomous driving software technology companies. This new venture will leverage the company's hardware development capabilities and manufacturing competitiveness. So it sounded to me like basically they're going to build
They're going to build the car for these other developers to integrate software into.
right.
It sounds like they're going to build vehicles for Waymo, is what it means.
Yeah,
Could be.
And maybe, could be anyone else, May Mobility, other startups that want to do this, maybe even some delivery type, middle mile, last mile type stuff. Probably more like last mile.
I would think last
So,
month.
so here's a question for you guys. Okay, do you think that these predictions that they're making are more realistic than those predictions we heard from General Motors in 2021 about BrightDrop?
Well, they are, because we already know that the BrightDrop predictions are.
They've still got a shot at it because it's not to that time
tends to
frame.
do a pretty good job of
I
saying we're going to
think
do
so.
this and
So
doing it.
But so did GM. I mean, that's why. So look, I was working on the book, my last interview with Mary Barr for this. I said, look, Mary, I said, this whole doubling of revenue, all these things, was the most un-Mary thing I've ever seen, because like GM always hits its financial guidance, and up until that pretty bold plan, like her credibility was pretty ironclad when they said they were going to do something, vehicle launches being on certain times. They did it. All these technology things are really difficult to do, especially for a company that's been doing the same thing for 100 years, like all the established car companies have. So, Hyundai does have the benefit that they're doing this now when we know what the autonomous and electric vehicle worlds we have a better view anyway of what they look like. Still unclear where they're going to go, but a better view of where they're going to go.
Yeah.
So it's a little more realistic from that
Correct.
standpoint.
It is,
But let me finish my thought on that. Hyundai tends to hit what it says it's going to do, but this 30% increase in sales by the end of the decade.
Big one.
Jeff, is the global market going to grow 30% by then?
I can guarantee you not.
Okay, so there you go. Number
Right.
one.
So they're
It's
going to
not
take
gonna-
share.
The
right?
market's not going to
They're
grow
going to
that
take
much.
share.
They're getting their
The
clocks
market
cleaned.
is going to grow.
Hyundai is getting its clock cleaned in China.
Worse than GM and worse than Volkswagen.
Yes, and it started before those guys. Number
They've
two
been selling
is the
plants.
Chinese are steamrolling through Southeast Asia to the degree that Hyundai Kia play any role in those markets.
Yeah.
They're going to get their clocks cleaned, and so are the Japanese too, by the way.
It's mostly the Japanese.
So is Hyundai
dominated
going to get 30% growth in the other markets of the world? The only major ones are Europe and the United States. I don't see that happening. Not enough to have an
I think
overall
that's
global 30%
30%
growth.
is a big number.
So
some of
I
that's
s-
going to be global growth, obviously.
So the 30% thing,
Or
I'm
recovery.
highly skeptical they'll hit.
Yeah, I think it's aggressive. I think, I mean, they've had strong success, I think, with what they've done, and they've taken a good approach looking across different technologies, their vehicles and their footprint from lower cost all the way up the spectrum have done fairly well with consumers here and in Europe.
I would say very well. in
I
fact.
think they have a strong base, but then to continue that growth on top of what they've done already, I think is going to be really challenging.
That's how I
Is
see
it possible that they could address markets that are underserved? I mean, I think, for example, of India, which I think is going to be the next place that people start looking at more and more.
Been talked about many years.
There are a
as
lot
the
of
next-
issues to adding more cars there, though. I
There
mean,
are.
the roads and infrastructure are still bad,
And there's still
and the
such a,
congestion is is already terrible there. Like, do they really want more cars, or did they need like a serious investment in public transit?
Yeah. and to see the middle class grow, that's the other. It's growing.
Right. But having said all those negatives about India, it's getting a lot of attention
Oh,
from
it is.
automakers.
It is.
Because to Gary's point, a lot of people believe the potential there could be massive.
Potential is massive. It's just, will it become
But
reality?
and
Well, but
remember
over
what
what
time frame?
Right.
Well, we talked about it for a long time. I mean, we used to talk about brick, right? And somehow that I just didn't,
Yeah.
and
didn't
it just
quite
went straight
right.
to the C.
Right. Well, and Brazil never really did it either,
Right.
right?
And Russia.
And Russia,
There you go.
everyone wants to be
Maybe
in
the
Russia.
C got separated from
Yeah.
the rest of
Well, yeah.
And now the C is politically difficult, and
And the R is just buying cars from China.
Exactly.
Here's a question. We saw this week that Tesla had a federal court reinstate a lawsuit it had filed essentially against the state of Louisiana and its motor vehicle and dealer group. I guess it must have been a state court had dismissed Tesla's suit, suing because it's banned from selling direct to consumers. A federal court said, no, you can sue them. Where's this go? I've often wondered, why doesn't Tesla push this all the way to the Supreme Court? In my opinion, that's purely what this is. All these states limiting and banning or, constraining Tesla is constraint of interstate trade. I learned in high school that was illegal. David, what do you think?
I think if they push it, they'd have a pretty good case.
Yeah.
Look, my understanding is, I remember reading, this might have been in an opinion from the Commerce Department, that the state franchise laws were meant to protect franchise dealers from company stores. So the company...
Correct. That's correct.
So if that was the original intent and that's why they're there, and Tesla doesn't have any independent dealers, the franchise laws aren't protecting anyone from Tesla selling direct to consumers. And also, theoretically, all Tesla would have to do to obey state laws, minus if the franchise law is gone, is just make sure you're doing whatever the DMV and the registrars want and you're obeying vehicle loan regulations. Why shouldn't they be? So if that's the intent, going in there with that Commerce Department opinion is, that's a pretty strong opinion to have on your side. Now, look, they haven't taken it this far, and we have to wonder why. Like, did their attorneys find some reason why that's not going to happen for them? But I think they'd have I think it'd be a really interesting fight to watch.
Mm.
I heard one theory that maybe Elon didn't want to push this because if Tesla makes it legal through a Supreme Court decision that you can sell direct to consumers, everyone's going to pile in, and then Tesla would not have a competitive advantage. Right. But, that thinking might have been true if it was ever when Tesla was growing at 50% a year. They're not growing. In fact, their sales in the U.S. have stagnated right now.
Declining.
They need to open more markets. I mean, they're hamstrung in the U.S. They need to open up opportunity. So maybe now's the time to push this all the way to the Supreme Court.
Yes, I mean, why do they want to own retail stores? I mean, it's a lot more capital and it's a lot more employees for a business that's already really capital intensive. Having a bunch of leases or locations, brick and hardware on your books. I mean, it does give you control. You keep all the retail profits.
Yeah.
There are pros and cons to having franchise dealer network versus running it yourself. I think if you're the size of Rivian, you want to own it and control it yourself. The bigger you get, the tougher it is to be
more challenging, right? To
control it. Now, it's also tough to control dealers, but the dealer franchise system, for all the heat it gets, the markup isn't that big. That's what I tell when people ask me, like, I'm trying to negotiate my car deal. I'm like, unless you're buying a $80,000 car, like the difference between invoice and MSRP isn't that, like, you're not fighting over that much money. And you got to remember, out of that markup, that's the dealer has to pay the commission plus the lights and the heat, and air conditioning and everything else. It's not a lot of money. They don't make much money in the new car showroom.
No, the big problem with franchise dealers is you got all that inventory just sitting there depreciating, and
that you're paying for.
And if now having
is that going to go away with company-owned stores?
Well,
I mean, theoretically it could, but
it's not a.
It isn't an issue. So if Tesla has its own stores, I've got to believe there is a percentage of people who feel more comfortable in purchasing a vehicle from someone that they're sitting across from and talking to, and they're not reaching those people now, right? So to your point, of opening new markets. Well, this opens a whole new demographic to them that they're not touching right now by
Well-
not having stores.
Look, in Michigan, because every state's different. So the way that Michigan has put the shackles on Tesla is you can legally buy a Tesla in the state of Michigan, but you have to go outside of the state to get the car titled.
Right.
Then you have to bring it back
Mhm.
into the
Get it
state
retitled.
and get a Michigan title. And so that's friction in the system. If you remove that and make the sales a whole lot easier, I don't think that Tesla is necessarily looking to put dealers all over in every community. They just want to put more distribution points. So you go online, you have this fantastic buying experience. You go through 8 or 10 screens, boom, boom, boom. The car is yours. You go get it.
Go get it.
Would they
or-
sell
or
more
it's delivered to
vehicles?
you, Yeah.
I mean, they do have. I think there's one at Somerset where you can go and look
There
at a
is.
Tesla.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
just a showroom. It's
Right.
Sure.
it's a display area.
So, but if they had more sales points and people could go check out the
Your
cars,
sales
more
point is your
convenient.
phone. Your sales point's your laptop.
Yeah, but not
No, what I'm
everyone wants
saying is
do
to,
that,
to
though,
Gary's
Jeff.
to Gary's point,
Go.
would they sell more cars if they had more locations where people could walk into some kind of, doesn't have to be a franchise dealer. They could walk into a showroom,
I think
Yes, they would sell more
Clear.
cars.
sit in the
Clearly.
car.
Absolutely.
Now, arguably, because their interiors are so Spartan and awful compared to like the other luxury brands,
Minimalist, we'll call it.
Yeah. Bauhaus simplicity. If people sat in them, would they be less likely to buy than just looking at it online? I'm being kind of sarcastic here, but I've talked to people who've looked at Teslas and they're used to buying driving luxury cars, and they're like, the interior is not that nice. I'm like, yeah, that's not what you're getting. Like, you're getting the huge touch screen and like their infotainment system and all that is, and the over-the-air updates, like
The
they're-
best. It's
Yes,
the best.
they're ahead of everybody technologically on that. You're getting in the same way. I mean, you like an iPhone and an iWatch is not an artistic piece of design, but it's a great piece of HMI and first-rate technology. And Tesla's like that, right? Like they're on top of the technology game, and that's what people are paying a lot of money for.
Yeah. Well, personally, I hope they take this to the Supreme Court. To your point, David, that's going to be a hell of a battle
Oh,
to
it would
watch
be.
if it happens.
grab your popcorn, right?
Right.
I wonder if they'd even need to get that far, though, because it used to be that movie studios couldn't own theaters, and that has changed, which seems to go to your point of why there would be protection for independent retailers versus company stores. So basically, you think, Paramount Theater is
Right.
showing Paramount movies, and
Look, this
the
would
guy
probably
down
go
the
to the
street.
Supreme Court because, once it starts to win beyond Louisiana and goes into federal courts, then I think NADA and the dealer groups,
They're going to want to.
they pile in
They're going to want to step in.
and they're going to fight this thing tooth and nail.
Yes, they
and
are.
it would probably end up in the Supreme Court,
Right.
no matter
May
what.
not start, but yeah. No.
So as we're wrapping up here, Jeff, do you see anything on the horizon that may increase auto sales besides Tesla having dealerships?
I still think there is demand that hasn't been satisfied from the pandemic. We talked about affordability. Will we see those buyers come back in? That's still a big question. I think the near term, it feels like there's more downside pressure, or at least market leveling off at where we're at and not continuing to grow than there is growth opportunity. We have marginal growth over the next few years, but it's starting to top out. So big question, I guess, will be, will that consumer that was displaced come back into the new car market over the next few years? I think that's something we'll have to wait and see.
Up to the automakers.
It really is.
You got to
Pricing
come
and
out with
interest rates.
killer product that
Yep.
people can afford.
Yep.
You do that, and everything
And-
gets solved.
Oh, absolutely.
So
What's
It's easy, right?
What's the likelihood of that happening?
across the board, not at all. But in certain segments,
Yeah, I
absolutely.
think we'll see some emerging of.
we talked about the Maverick or the Trax earlier. They see the success, and it's like, wow, how do we do this again?
Yeah, or and others will jump on it.
Right. So
Development time's down. It doesn't take as long to catch up, in theory.
Mhm.
It's got to be a nice vehicle. I mean, I remember when they had the event and they showed the tracks. Former colleague and good friend Dave Kiley was there covering it for Wards. I was there for Bloomberg, and we walked out of this thing, and Dave said to me, he said, I got to give them credit. They really tried to make this a nice vehicle, even though it starts at like 21,000. I said, I know. And I said, it'd be interesting to see how it sells. And it is. You give people a vehicle that isn't just, bare bones. You give them something, some good content and value at a price that most households can afford. It'll sell.
And it looks good, honestly.
It actually
For what it
does.
is, I
Yeah.
think.
I mean, like styling is subjective, but
Sure.
and the Trailblazer too, that transacts in the 20 range,
Yeah.
25 range. They've had pretty good success with that. And Hyundai and Kia do very well down there, and they offer a lot of value in those price points. There's money to be made if somebody wants to go down into those segments.
This is an incredibly complicated industry. But on another level, it's pretty simple. Just do good stuff and price it right, and
Bring out
it takes
great
care of
product
everything.
and price it right. That's it.
Real good. Well, with that, we're going to wrap it up. Jeff, so good to have you back on.
Great to be
on the
here.
show. Back in the studio.
Back in the
too,
studio as
especially.
well.
David,
yeah.
always good to have you on the show.
Great to be here, John.
Gary, always great to be with you.
Do it next week.
Thanks, people, for having tuned in.
AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.